Welcome back, Biomonsters. Today we're going to be talking about how living things actually get energy. And we know that energy is important for all living things, so this is an important concept.
Yeah, this was actually one of our 5 things it takes to be alive, right?
That's right.
All living things have metabolism, which means they have to break down food in order to make energy.
Yeah.
And so today we're going to talk about how they do that.
Okay. And just a reminder, you guys, remember that in the past when we talked about metabolism, we were discussing chemical reactions. So while we're going over these notes, we want you to think back to things like cellular respiration and photosynthesis. All right, let's dive in. So I guess the first thing that we have to do is actually talk about how living things get their energy, and I guess that would mean that there are 2 basic classifications.
There are. So the first type of classification are our producers or autotrophs. So can you tell us a little bit about them?
Sure. The word producer sounds like the word produce, and if we think about if you're producing something, it means that you're making something on your own. So producers make their own food, and because they make their own food, we can say they automatically make food. They're also called autotrophs.
It's like do it yourself, all on your own.
And we've already talked about a way in which producers or autotrophs actually make their food. What was the thing that we talked about?
We talked about the process of photosynthesis, which means synthesizing food using energy from light or from the sun.
And we know that there's one kingdom in particular in which all the organisms are autotrophic and producers and participate in photosynthesis.
And that is our plants.
Very nice.
We want to keep in mind, though, that there is this other way to make your own food using energy from chemicals instead of from the sun. And it has a very similar name. It's called chemosynthesis. And we're not going to go into a lot of details of this process, but we should know that there are some weird living things out there that can do it.
Yeah, so there are 2 ways in which organisms can make their own food. One is photosynthesis using energy from the sun, and the other one is chemosynthesis, which sounds like chemicals, right, or chemistry. So using chemicals to actually synthesize their own food. And again, they're all called autotrophs.
All right. So the other way that organisms can make their own food is by being consumers or heterotrophs.
And consumers consume things from their environment. So they're getting their food from an outside source. So they're not making their own food. So if we take a look here, we have lots of different examples of consumers. Some of them are more obvious than others. If we look on the left here, we have a lion that is consuming
or eating a zebra. This would be an example of a type of interaction we've mentioned before, which is predation. We have a very clear predator and prey.
Right. And so this is the only way that the lion is going to be able to get food because it can't make food on its own. If we look at the middle here, this one is unique because every year we have people who make mistakes with this. What kingdom of life is this organism from?
This is a mushroom, so it's from the kingdom fungi.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is people look at mushrooms and they think, oh, they look kind of like a plant. They're just sitting there. They must get energy the same way that plants do by photosynthesis, but that would be wrong.
Yeah, so fungus actually have a lot more in common with us in terms of the way that they get their energy than they do with plants, because these guys actually have to get their food from an outside source. And we've already talked about the way in which they do it. They have a unique way of consuming food from their environment. And how do they do that, Ms. Hines?
They actually sort of secrete enzymes into the environment that break down their food. And then the key part is that they absorb it. They kind of suck it up from the environment.
Yeah, so they don't have a stomach, so we keep our digestive enzymes inside of us. We take in food, and then it gets broken down in our stomachs, and that's how we absorb it. Fungus don't have that option, so instead they just secrete the enzymes on top of their food, whatever they're growing on, and then once it gets broken down, they absorb it into their cells. And then finally, if we look at the right-hand side, what is that guy?
That is a tick.
All right, and so why are ticks going to be a part of our consumer discussion?
Because they also have to eat to get energy. In particular, they like to suck blood from different hosts, including deer and dogs and us. Yeah, and this is actually an example of a symbiotic relationship that we've mentioned earlier in the year, where the tick is sucking blood and getting nutrients, so it's
going to be a
helped.
positive.
Yeah.
But then whatever the tick is sucking blood from is actually being hurt. So it's going to be a negative. So it's going to be a positive-negative relationship, and we know that that happens to be
parasitism.
Parasitism. Now, one thing that we want you to keep in mind, even though all 3 of these organisms are very distinct and they all eat different things, the one thing that they have in common is that they're all eating food from their environment. So they're not making their own food. They're getting their food from their environment and they're consuming it. Therefore, they're heterotrophs.
Right. So because there's such a diversity in heterotrophs in terms of what they consume, we actually have different sort of sub-classifications for our heterotrophs. So the first one we're going to talk about are the organisms that eat only plants.
All right, so if something eats only plants, what are we going to call it?
It's called an herbivore.
And what's an easy way to remember that?
Well, easy way to remember that is that herbs are plants. Yeah, or you could even do a little word art on your paper and kind of make the letters in herbivore into some plants.
Excellent. And again, anything that only eats plants, if it's eating a plant, it's still a consumer, still a heterotroph, but it's a specific classification of a heterotroph called an herbivore.
The second classification are things that eat plants and animals. They kind of eat it all, and these guys are called the
omnivores. And if we look at these pictures, you'll notice that we have two pictures of the same thing. We have brown bears that are both consuming food from their environment. On the picture on the left, you'll notice that the bear is eating plant species from the hillside. And the picture on the right, you'll notice that the bear is eating fish, which is meat or animals.
Right. And a good way to remember this is I like to picture the O in omnivore as being a big mouth that's open wide, because it's ready to eat just about anything. Plants, animals, whatever comes its way.
Question for you, Ms. Hines. What are we?
Oh, we're going to actually try that in a Stop and Jot in just a few minutes. Okay, and then lastly, we have our carnivores.
All right. And what do carnivores eat?
They eat animals only.
Okay.
Here's the tricky thing about carnivores there. When people think of carnivores, they tend to think of really big organisms like lions and tigers. But actually very small organisms can be carnivores too, like this guy or lady who we've seen before.
All right, so this is our bolas spider.
Right.
And our bolas spider is unique in that it uses a bolas, right, to catch its prey, a little whip to catch its prey, but it's only eating other insects. And because it's only eating other insects, it's only eating animals. It's still not making its food. It's getting its food from an outside source, so it's still a consumer, still a heterotroph, but it's a specific classification of a heterotroph called a
carnivore.
All right.
All right, the next category is our scavengers.
What do scavengers do?
Scavengers eat animals that they're recently dead. So they don't actually hunt and kill their food. They just kind of eat things that have already died on their own.
Okay, and what is this a picture of?
This is a picture of a crab, which is a scavenger on the floor of the ocean that kind of will eat parts of things that have recently died.
Okay, so again, we're still talking about consumers. We're still talking about heterotrophs. Right. But this is a unique classification of heterotroph where we're eating things, only animals, that have recently died. Right. So we're not actually hunting and killing them.
And then lastly, we have a very, very important class of heterotrophs, which are our decomposers.
Yeah, and if you look at our picture, you'll notice that we see things, it's the classic toadstool shape, so we know that we're dealing with fungus. And we already told you one of the major mistakes that students have every year in biology is they think fungus and plants. No, fungus are consumers. They cannot make their own food. So they have to get their food from an outside source. And we already told you that these guys are external digesters, but we didn't talk about what they were digesting externally yet.
Right, so oftentimes what fungus are digesting is dead, decaying material, like this dead log. So they're secreting enzymes and then they're absorbing sort of dead log into their bodies for energy. And what's so important about our decomposers is that they are what help recycle nutrients in the environment.
Yes, they play an important role. Again, decomposers are consumers. They're heterotrophs because they're not making their own food, but they're a special class of heterotroph called decomposers. And a great example would be fungus.
Okay, so at this point you need to pause the video and answer the Stop and Jot question on your paper. What we want you to do is think about how would you classify yourself? Are you a producer or a consumer? An autotroph or a heterotroph? And if you are a heterotroph, what kind are you? So go ahead and try that Stop and Jot and make sure you explain why and then show your answer to your teacher.
Good luck, guys. All right, the next thing that we need to talk about is how do we show what organisms are eating? Because we do know that no organism in the environment is its own island. So all organisms are connected. And the connection is what we want to pay attention to because we actually want to see how things are moving. So how energy is flowing from different organisms.
Okay, so we can show what organisms eat using either a food chain, or a food web.
Okay.
And in a food chain or food web, there will be arrows that connect the food to the eater. Now, believe it or not, this is a source of trouble for a lot of students, is remembering what direction the arrow goes. So what I like to picture is I like to picture a big mouth like this with an arrow going into the mouth, and you can see the arrow kind of makes up the mouth. And here's the food, maybe a hamburger, going in.
Nice.
Now, why does the arrow go that way? What is the arrow representing?
The arrow is actually representing how energy is flowing, or in which direction energy is moving. So we want to know where energy it originated and where the energy is now going towards, or
so
what
that
direction
makes
it's
sense
going
because
towards.
the energy goes from the food to the organism that eats it.
That's right.
So go ahead and try on your paper the stop and jot question that is about this food chain right here.
All right. Good luck, guys. And make sure that you call your teacher over when you think you have the right answer. All right, so still talking about how we show what organisms are eating and also how energy is flowing through a group, a diverse group of organisms. So let's go ahead and use this example food web that we actually see on the screen here. Now I have a question for you. How do you know it's a food web versus a food chain?
So in a food chain, every organism only ate one thing. And also every organism only got eaten by one thing. But really in a real life situation, that's not very realistic. Lots of organisms eat more than one thing or get eaten by more than one organism. So that's our big difference between a food chain and a food web. So for example, these grass, these leaves, this producer at the bottom is getting eaten by multiple organisms in the food web.
Right. So what we want you to do is study the food web. Remember what we told you about the arrows. Think about the arrow going into the mouth of another organism and think about what that means in terms of energy flow.
Okay, and try these stop and jot questions on your paper.
And when you think you have the right answer, call your teacher over to check it for correctness.
So besides just producers and consumers, we can also sort of group similar organisms into what are called trophic levels, which are basically like a feeding group. A group of organisms that share a similar feeding pattern.
Okay, and why would we talk about feeding groups, Ms. Hines? Why is that significant?
Because that tells us about how organisms obtain energy and how energy flows through an ecosystem.
Yeah, and it also tells us how much energy is present within those organisms.
Right. So when we count a trophic level, we always count starting from the bottom of the food chain. Now, who's usually at the bottom?
It's usually going to be a producer.
Right, like this algae. And I can tell, how can you tell this algae is the producer?
Because notice that the algae is not eating anything else. And if it's not eating anything else, it means that it can't be a consumer, because that's the defining characteristic of a consumer. So how is the algae actually getting its energy?
It's getting its energy from something that's not shown in the food chain but is implied, which is the
sun.
Sun.
So what type of organism, what type of producer is our algae?
It is a plant and it's doing photosynthesis.
All right.
All right, so we're going to start counting from the bottom. So the algae would be the first trophic level, our striped fish would be our second trophic level, and our spotted fish would be our third trophic level. But we have some other names in addition to just first, second, and third that we sometimes use for those organisms.
Okay, so what would we call our the organisms in our second trophic level?
So our striped fish would be what's called our primary consumer. And that's because primary means first, and this is sort of the first organism that is consuming, that is eating. Because remember, our producers don't consume, they produce.
Right, so even though they're not the first organism in the food chain, they're the first organism that's actually eating food from its environment and not making it.
Okay, and you can probably guess what we might call the spotted fish. It's going to be the second thing that's eating, so we're going to call it the
secondary consumer.
Right, and we're actually going to jot down these notes on our paper on our next slide.
All right.
Okay, so again, just to recap, our first trophic level is always our
bottom one, and it's always going to be a producer.
Right, and sometimes they're called primary producers, but sometimes we just leave off the primary because we know they're first since they're the producers.
But you do want to keep in mind that it's implied that something else is also a part of the food chain or the food web. And if it's a producer, we know that it has to get energy in order to generate its own food. So typically we're going to assume that what is also going to be there?
That the sun.
Okay. All right, so then what's going to eat our primary producer?
Is going to be our primary or first level consumer.
And our first level consumer, again, if it's a consumer, we know that it's a heterotroph and it's eating our autotroph.
Ah, interesting. So we have a special name for those producers that eat for those consumers that eat producers or plants. These are going to tend to be our...
If they're only eating plants, these guys are going to be our herbivores.
Right. All right, our next level is our secondary consumers.
And our secondary consumers are going to be, in most cases, consuming our primary consumers.
So in most cases, they're going to be eating other animals, which would make them a
carnivore.
But in some cases, these guys will also eat some of the producers, some plants, in which case they would be a...
they would be an omnivore.
Right.
Think about the big mouth. Now, if we're talking about just a food chain where everything is really linear, we would assume that it's a carnivore. But remember how we told you there are these food webs, and we know that energy flow is not linear. It's not simplistic like that. So you want to make sure that you're following all the arrows.
And then the fourth trophic level is our tertiary or third level consumers, the third guys who are consuming, who are eating. And these guys are almost always carnivores who are feeding on our secondary and primary consumers. But it's important to note that lots of organisms can fit into multiple trophic levels at different times during their life or depending on what they're eating.
Yeah, depending on which food web they're actually a part of.
Right. So we can also illustrate our trophic levels using what's called an ecological pyramid. So again, we see the same idea that we saw before, which is that the producers are the first level on the bottom, and then it goes primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. But I noticed that the sections on my pyramid are getting smaller and smaller towards the top.
Yeah, which leads me to allude back to what we talked about at the very beginning of our video. We told you that we were interested in energy flow and how much energy is present in different groupings of organisms. So the actual shape or size of each level on my ecological pyramid actually is indicative of how much energy is present within those organisms.
So where is there the most energy present then?
Well, there's the most energy, and this is always going to be true, there's always the most energy present from organisms that directly use the sun's energy to make their own food.
Because they basically have an infinite supply, because the sun is always shining for the most part.
So it's always going to be, the most energy is always going to be in our producers or our autotrophs, because they're going to get their energy from sunlight.
Right. And who's going to tend to have the least energy in a food web?
The person or the individuals that are going to have the least amount of energy are the individuals who are furthest away from the organisms that directly produce their own food.
Okay, so kind of those top consumers, those individuals that are secondary and tertiary consumers,
That's right.
They're going to have the least energy available to them.
Because every time energy moves from one organism to the next, we're losing a little bit of that energy every time there's a jump. So the organism that's furthest away from directly utilizing the energy of the sun is going to have the least amount of energy, which is represented in the size of the little shape that they're actually found in.
Right. Okay, so go ahead and try this stop and jot question on your paper, and when you're done, have your teacher come over and check your answer for correctness.